So welcome everybody. This week's Torah portion is Pinchas, and that translates. I think it's in English. It's referred to as Phineas, right?
Yes.
Okay, Phineas. I don't like that word. Pinchas is nicer, but we can call him whatever you want. All right. Anyway, now actually, this is very interesting because the Torah portion really begins kind of in the middle of a story. Last week, at the very end of the Torah portion, we started a new story, and it was about how these girls of Moab and Midian came and seduced some of the men of Israel, to come and worship Baal Peor, which was one of the pagan worships that involved also a lot of sexual behaviors. Overt sexual behaviors that was part of the worship of Peor. And so that was really bad. That's at the very end. And what happens at the very end is, God gets very angry. And well, there's a point at which Moses is seeing what's going on, and he's kind of paralyzed. Like he doesn't know what to do. He doesn't do anything. God speaks to him and says, you've got to go and isolate these people that are doing it and kill them or whatever. And he then goes and says to the judges and the policemen, go do this. And like no one seems to be doing it. And then all of a sudden Pinchas comes. And this is actually, there's an additional provocation here, because there's this fellow who is who takes a Midianite woman, and they stand there in front of everybody. They're doing something bad or whatever, and at that moment in time, Phineas acts. And he takes a sword, and he just impales the two of them and kills them on the spot. And as soon as he does that, the plague that God had sent that was ravishing the nation for the sin stopped. And at the end, there were 24,000 people who had died in the plague. Okay, the last week's Torah portion ends right there. This Torah portion, we have God's judgment on Phineas, and it's actually very, very positive. And I'll just read the beginning. We're in chapter 25, verse 10. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Phineas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron the priest, has turned back my wrath from the Israelites by displaying among them his passion. Now, I don't like this translation, because the word that is being translated, the Hebrew word here is kin'ah, and we have it used twice, both as a verb and as a noun. And basically, kin'ah is a word that's also used for jealousy. It's also used for zealousness. Okay, in English, those words are very similar. But if I were to translate this better, it would be that he was zealous for my zealousness. Okay, and so that I did not wipe out the Israelite people in my zealousness. God is talking. So basically, what we have here is that Phineas's act is deemed an act of zealousness, but thanks to that act of zealousness, it prevented God's act of zealousness, which was his sending this plague, which had it been led to continue, the entire nation would have been wiped out. So we definitely see that, well, which we probably figured out already, this was quite a zealous act when Phineas comes with his sword and he just like impales these two people, albeit they had sinned greatly, albeit it was very provocative. They come in front of everybody. They come in front of Moses as if they are saying, okay, what are you going to do to us? What are you going to do to us? And Moses is paralyzed. He's doing nothing. And everybody else is just like, what are we supposed to do? And then Phineas comes and goes, whoa, get him in the belly. And so here, clearly, on the one hand, this is considered an act of zealousness. On the other hand, God has nothing but praise for Phineas for doing this at this point. And it's very interesting that he's balancing God's zealousness, which is very negative, his zealousness to punish the nation. On the other hand, it is Phineas's counter zealousness to carry out a very, let's say, a very focused punishment on the two people who deserve it most, and that way God's zealousness is requited, and the plague is stopped. Then we see what God says next. Say, therefore, I grant him a pact of peace. Now, in my English, it says friendship. I don't know why it says friendship. It's peace. Brit shalom. Okay? A pact, a covenant, my covenant of peace. That's what it is. Okay? And he says as follows. Then he continues to say, not just a pact of peace, but a pact or a covenant of priesthood. And basically what happens is God grants Phineas two things. He says a covenant of peace on the one hand, and the other hand, a covenant of eternal priesthood. And basically what he's saying is that the line of priesthood, now Phineas is Aaron's grandson. He is the son of Eleazar, who is the son of Aaron. Okay? And so, but there's two sons, and we already know that Eleazar is going to succeed Aaron in the priesthood. So that we already know. And now basically Eleazar has a few different sons, and what he is saying is that it will be the son, it'll be Eleazar, from Eleazar to Phineas, and that will be the line of priests that will continue. What I want to focus on though now is this issue of peace, because I find it a little odd. On the one hand, God is praising Phineas for an extremely violent act, and yet he is giving him a covenant of peace. They don't seem to go together. And one of the ways that many people interpret this is that on the one hand, Phineas's actions right now were exactly what was needed at this time. Sometimes situations demand extreme activity. They demand violence. They demand rapid response. This is not the time to sit around hemming and hawing and saying, okay, maybe we'll arrest them and put them on trial, or what should we do? This was a situation that was rapidly getting out of hand. And it wasn't just getting out of hand because there was this plague raging that God had sent, but it was getting out of hand because of the provocative nature of everything that was going on. The fact that this whole large numbers of people were going to worship this Baal Peor in a very obvious, very provocative way, sexually, all out there. And there was something about this whole activity, which of course is highlighted by this couple and what they're doing, that the whole thing is really it's rebelliousness, but it's just very provocative. It's very, very, let's see what you're gonna do to me. Look what I'm doing. And therefore, in that kind of situation, there is a need for immediate activity, because you need to have a statement. You need to have a very bold statement that says, this is not acceptable. This kind of activity is not acceptable. This is a direct confrontation against God. And therefore, what is required is people to come and say, I am standing here and stopping this. And basically, you get the sense that God, they are coming up confrontational against God. But at the same time, God is responding with a plague. What God wants, though, is for other people there to take God's stand and to stand up and say, this is not acceptable. This is making God angry. And that will enable God to stand back and to stop the plague. And so it was very, very essential to do what Phineas did. However, this kind of behavior can be very dangerous. It is one thing for a person to exhibit this zealousness, to respond to a particularly provocative event that requires and demands this kind of behavior. But if this is the kind of response that will happen to everything that goes wrong, you have a real problem. And therefore, many people interpret this covenant of peace as giving Phineas a gift that will help him moderate his activity. In other words, this quality of Phineas that enables him to be decisive, to be violent when necessary, is important. But at the same time, alongside this, he will need this covenant of peace. Now, let's look and see what happens to Phineas later on. So not so later on, actually, right after this event, we have, as a result of this whole situation with the Midianites and the Moabites and what they did in seducing the nation to Baal Peor, Moses already commands the nation that they have to take revenge upon the Midianites. And indeed, in chapter 31, we see them actually going to war, striking against the Midianites, and essentially taking revenge for what they did to the Israelites here with the whole situation of Baal Peor. And what we will notice is when this happens, now remember, Phineas is a priest, and priests do have a role in war. They would go out before the war. They would go out and accompany them. Sometimes they would even go with the Ark of the Covenant, or it was probably a separate ark that went out to war. It wasn't the same one that sat in the tabernacle, but that's open to interpretation. But clearly, a priest had a role in war, but we never thought of him as having an active role in the military side of things, okay? But here, in this case, Phineas is mentioned specifically in the context of this war. And I'm looking now at chapter 31, verse 6. Moses dispatched them on the campaign, 1,000 from each tribe, with Phineas, the son of Eleazar, the priest, for the army, for the military, equipped with the sacred utensils and the trumpets for sounding the blast. So on the one hand, we have the use of the word sava, which is a military or army. Okay, so on the one hand, he is part of this military campaign, and on the other one, he is taking with him the holy vessels and the trumpets. The trumpets, of course, are on the one hand very physical, but on the other hand, they're definitely a way of connecting a call to God with the war. And at the end, and so I don't know, I just felt it was very interesting that as they all go to war, Phineas is noted specifically. Nobody else's name is there. I mean, we don't even know who is the general of this war. The only person who's mentioned is Phineas. And I have to believe that this same decisiveness and actual violent act that he became identified with at the story at the beginning is something that they decide they need. Moses and God decide this is something the nation needs. A person like Phineas needs to be present at this war. And we see some interesting things happening in this war. For example, Moses says, did you keep the women alive? And they said, yes. He says, no, you've got to kill the women, because the women were the main ones that were involved in this whole thing. They were the ones who seduced the men. And there's also special mention in verse 8 of the fact that Balaam of that prophet that we talked about last week, that he was killed as well, because he is seen as the person who initiated this whole idea. So, there's some very specific actions going on here. This is not a war of conquest, where the point is to capture a city, and then you need more strategy and whatever. This is a war of revenge. And therefore, it makes sense that Phineas is somebody that needs to be here to carry that message forward and to act on that kind of thing. However, on the other hand, we meet in book of Joshua, we meet a Phineas who has, on the verge of a possible civil war, actually seems to use this covenant of peace that God has granted him to avoid a situation of war and instead end up with peace. And what's that situation? This is in Joshua chapter 22. They're already, they've conquered the land, they're settling, everything seems to be fine. And if you recall, there were the 2.5 tribes, Reuben, Gad, and half of the tribe of Manasseh that was participating in the war. And then when the war was over, they were going to go back to the eastern part of the Jordan where they had their own territory, and that had already happened. And it turns out that when they went back, they built, or at least rumor has it, that they have built an altar. And the nation on the other side are very concerned. Oh my, are they separating themselves from us? Are they building an altar that will compete with the altar that is in Shiloh? And there's a great deal of concern about it, okay? And so They come together, and actually what's going on, and we see this in Joshua chapter 22, verse 12. It says here, the Israelites heard about this. They had built this altar, and they gathered the entire nation at Shiloh in order to make war on them. That was their initial thing. Oh my goodness, they're separating themselves, they're rebelling, whatever. And instead of making war, we learn in verse 13 that they sent Phineas to go to them. They decided to send a delegation to go and speak to these tribes, 2.5 tribes, and find out what was really going on. And it's Phineas who is the leader of this delegation. And they come and they talk to them. And at the end of this, they found out, no, they did not build an altar. They're building some sort of monument. And basically this monument is a way to help them connect with their brothers on the other side of the Jordan. They don't see themselves as competing or with Shiloh in any way. And it's a very nice, peaceful ending. But one of the things that I found very interesting is at the end of the story, Joshua chapter 22, verse 31, Phineas, the son of Eleazar, the priest, said to the sons of Reuben, the sons of Gad, and the sons of Manasseh, today I know that God is amongst them, that you did not rebel against God in this way, and you have therefore saved the children of Israel from the mighty hand of God. And if I look at this, the way he words this, I see that Phineas is concerned that he has another Baal Peor on his hands. Not idolatry, not this kind of sexual provocation, but we have a situation of angering God through some provocation. And so what he says to him, after he has the conversation, what he's saying is that now I am relieved. I was worried that by your actions, you would bring God's wrath down upon us because you would have betrayed God or confronted God or rebelled against God. And so you see him really in the very same place as he was before. But in the previous situation, he understood that this was a situation that required very violent response. And in that way, he succeeded in abating God's anger. Here, on the other hand, he was able to use more peaceful means. He was able to confront them through conversation. And as a result of the conversation, understand that they were not rebelling God. But you can see it's the same concern. It's the same worry. So I think here in that situation, you have a sense of, on the one hand, Phineas, who has that same urgency to ensure that the nation is not angering God, and that he's able to stop that before it gets out of hand. But on the other hand, he understands initially he uses his sword, and in the later situation, he uses the covenant of peace that God has given him. Now, that's this part of the Torah portion. Now, there's another situation that develops in our Torah portion that I want to focus on, and we'll see how the two are actually related. And that's in chapter 27, beginning in verse 15. And this is the appointment of Joshua. Okay, right here again, we are now just really a few months before Moses dies. They're already at their final place before they enter the land. They have arrived in at the plains of Moab. They're right there, up right near the Jordan River. And Moses realizes he's going to die. We see in verse 12 that God says to Moses, go up to the Abarim heights. And he basically says to him, you see all the land that you're not going to enter because you're going to die soon. And as soon as that happens, Moses, of course, then says to God, okay, I'm dying soon. Who's gonna lead the nation after me? And this is a real concern. I mean, we talked about it already in the last few weeks. We saw that the change of leadership has been happening in the nation of Israel. It's a new generation. We've also seen Moses gradually weakening. We even saw this in the beginning of the story, the Phineas story, the whole situation of Baal Peor, where Moses is paralyzed. He doesn't know what to do. We've seen this in a number of situations where Moses has clearly reached the end of the line. He is no longer able to continue leading the nation, and we have to see the next generation take over. So in verse 15, Moses turns to God and asks them, we need a leader. And he mentions very specific, very specific characteristics that he is asking God to ensure will be in a future leader. He says as follows. Let the Lord, source of the spirit of all flesh, appoint someone over the community, someone who shall go out before them and come in before them, who shall take them out and bring them in, so that the Lord's community may not be like sheep that have no shepherd. Now, these words of go before them, come in before them, take them out and bring them in is usually assumed to refer to military leadership, okay? Someone who's going to take them out to war and bring them back in from war, someone who's going to go into the land and conquer the land and settle the land. Very much this in Moses's mind is foremost in his consciousness. This is the most important quality that this leader needs to have, because he's the one who's going to take them into the land of Israel. He's going to have to lead them in battle. He's going to have lead them to conquer the land. He also, though, talks about the fact that in general, they need leadership. They cannot be like sheep without a leader, without a shepherd. Okay, they need to have someone who'll be there and will say, after me, and the nation will follow. That's very, very important. God then says to Moses, take Joshua. He's the guy. And why? He doesn't go through any of these other characteristics that Moses mentions. He says for one reason only he's taking Joshua. He is a man who has the spirit within him. There's no mention here of military prowess or leadership or, the kind of guy who, when he says, come after me, I'm going to catch. He has the spirit. What does that mean? I think really what God is saying here is, first of all, we do know that Joshua has military leadership. When they first came out of Egypt, the very first war that Amalek came in Rephidim and attacked the nation, it was Joshua who led them in battle. So we know that Joshua, of all the people, is the guy who has military experience. So it makes sense, but that's not what God says. It could be that that's assumed. Okay, we have someone who has military experience, very good. But he's choosing him because he has spirit. Okay, now we met Joshua in a context of having spirit. And in fact, God even says in the sin of the spies, okay, when Joshua and Caleb are the ones who God says, they did not sin, therefore they're going to go into the land. He refers specifically to Caleb as someone who my spirit is in him. And then when he has both of them going in, the assumption is both of them have this spirit. What does that spirit mean? And I think what basically we're talking about, these are people who are directly have an understanding of God. God's spirit is within them. And so what God is basically saying is that less important is their military skills. Less important is how charismatic they are and how easy it will be for the nation to, how popular they will be among the nation, that the nation will do whatever they say. What God is saying is if they are true to the Spirit of God, if they are bringing the Spirit of God to the nation, that's their main role. And if they do that properly, then the nation will follow them because they will be following God's Spirit. And of course, if they don't follow God's Spirit, then the whole thing is a mess. Okay, but that this becomes the most important thing, and this is what God is saying. Now, in this week's portion, we essentially have two models of leadership. Okay, we have, and it's very interesting, by the way, driving home today, I had to do an errand, and I was on my way home, and I was listening to the radio, and ordinary radio, not religious radio, regular radio in Israel, and on Thursday afternoon, they have a little discussion of the Torah portion, and they sometimes have different guests who come in and give an insight. And they were talking to a particular rabbi who gave an insight that he actually was quoting a rabbi that lived about 150 years ago, and he said something that I thought was very interesting, and I'm kind of modifying that. He said, you have Phineas, who's a radical, who's an extremist, who's crazy, who sometimes has to do crazy things. Okay, That's what you need sometimes, okay? And, but yet he's not the one that gets chosen to be the leader. Joshua. Joshua, in many ways, is kind of boring. I mean, we know that he was a military guy, but I'll give you an example of another situation that he's a very, very dutiful. How many times in the Bible we hear Joshua referred to as a servant of Moses? He serves Moses. He's there. He doesn't. And there's one place where it says he doesn't move from Moses' tent. He's there to serve Moses. There's one point at which there are 70 men that are supposed to be prophesying. You know, the Spirit of God comes over them, and they're all supposed to come together. And it turns out Joshua discovers that there are two fellows that don't come with them, and they're still in the camp with everyone else, and yet they're prophesying. Joshua gets very mad. What do you mean? They're not allowed to prophesy. They're not among the 70 that are gathering here. He says, you got to put them in prison. And Moses says, no. We're not going to put him in prison. You get a sense there that he is so loyal to Moses that his main thing is he's looking out for Moses. He's serving Moses. He wants to make sure nobody is doing something independent of Moses. This is Joshua. Okay. So on the one hand, you have this firebrand Phineas. And on the other hand, you've got this Joshua who has military experience, but he seems to be just this loyal guy to Moses, you know. And who gets chosen? Joshua, not Phineas. And I think this tells us something as well. God thinks that the most important leader is the slow and steady one, the guy who is loyal to God, even if it doesn't mean, you know, loyal to Moses initially, but through Moses, loyal to God. The guy who's just going to do what he's supposed to do. All right. And Phineas, on the other hand, is someone you need. You notice when they went out to fight Midian, Phineas is there. Okay. Later on, at the end of the book of Joshua, Phineas is the one who ends up going with the delegation to Reuben and Gad. Joshua is still around. But there are certain specific roles that Phineas has to play. And when you need a Phineas, you call on a Phineas. But if you're talking about the guy who's going to have the overall responsibility, who's going to be the heir to Moses and do all of this, to be the one who takes them in and brings them out, but what does God say? The one who the Spirit of God is amongst them. Then you need a Joshua. You need someone who's calmer. You need somebody who's going to kind of be more reasoned, who's going to sit back and who's going to say, okay, what's the best way to do this now? God, please guide me. What am I supposed to do here? This is the right person for the overall leadership. And I think this tells us a lot about what we do today. Very often people will say today, oh, he's an extremist. He's crazy. He's too radical. He's too fanatic, you know? And it's true. We have to be very careful about extremists and fanatics. But on the other hand, every so often, an extremist and a fanatic is in the right place at the right time, provided he has God's covenant of peace with him. And he understands wise ways in which to, the appropriate ways in which to use this fanaticism that he has. Is the fanatic the kind of person you want to be the ongoing, president of the country for long term? Not necessarily. It's not the right personality. It's not the right characteristics. And this is what God has chosen. He's chosen the Joshua to take over from Moses as opposed to the Phineas. That's my message for today, but let's open it for discussion. Anybody who wants to comment or say anything, just open your mics and let's hear it. Anybody? I'm not hearing. Good.
Okay, I'll go.
Yes.
I'll go.
Good.
You were talking about Joshua having the Spirit, and he was the one that was chosen. The translation I have said that this is Hashem speaking to Moses, you shall place some of your majesty upon him. What do you think that means? It's mehodecha.
Right. Hod is majesty. Majesty is like this. It means this. I don't know, kind of atmosphere about it. There's a certain kind of dignity, a certain kind of otherworldly charisma, dignity that he has. But it's not meant as an ego kind of thing. It's meant as, this is somebody who is able to portray or convey this important thing. That is in verse 20. Okay.
Yes.
So it definitely, Moses himself has this extra special, or I would say aura. Aura is probably an even better word. There's something about the aura of Moses, and he's basically saying, hand that over to Joshua. He needs that aura in order to lead the people. But what I was referring to about the Spirit was in verse 18. The reason that God points Moses, he says, let's see. Well, in my English, it says an inspired man, but literally it is a man that has the Spirit in him. That is the literal translation. Isha sheruach bo, a man who has the Spirit in him. So I don't think inspired is like kind of weak. It's a lot more powerful than that.
So do you think this was something visible? He says to do it before their eyes. Do you think when they transfer this majesty stuff, that they could see something moving across from one to another?
No, I don't think it's physical, but I think it's something you can sense. I mean, haven't we all been in experiences where we see there's a certain electricity in the air, when there's a certain sense that's going on there? I think it's that kind of thing. It's not something you see, it's something you feel.
Okay. Good. That must have been pretty exciting.
Okay. It must have been. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Well, anyway, it's great seeing you all today, and we'll be back again next week.
Yeah, good seeing you too. Shalom.
Yes, Shabbat. Bye-bye.
Shabbat shalom.
Thank you. Shabbat shalom.
Thank you, Sondra.
I hope you enjoyed that video, and we'd like to be sure you're getting all of our video content. So just click on the subscribe button below, as well as on the notification bell, and that way you will have easy access to all our material. We look forward to staying in touch with you. God bless you, and have a wonderful day.